it's important for people to understand that understanding the rules of the road for exporting can certainly be very beneficial to companies who want to increase the bottom line. At the same time, there is a legal foundation within which companies and individuals who want to export operate. So those parties have to understand that many exports from the United States are restricted or controlled by the U.S. government. And what we're focusing on today is the Export Administration Regs, or the EAR, which governs most exported articles and technology. Let me just stop here and say one thing. You will find in both the exporting and importing communities that there's a lot of acronyms. It's very replete with alphabet soup of acronyms. And so if for any reason I fail or Jerry fails to define an acronym, by all means let us know and we'll go back and define it for you. But anyway, we're focused on the Export Administration Regulations, and being proficient in the Export Administration Regs can certainly be a business accelerator. At the same time, can help you mitigate risks. And so if you become savvy in understanding the Export Administration Regs, it'll help you figure out whether or not a license is required to export a particular item, or whether or not a license exception is available to you so that you can kind of avoid having to go in with the added delay and expense of looking for and receiving that license approval. However, the failure to use the right license or license exception can certainly result in a lot of bad and negative consequences, from delays, detentions, to seizures and penalties, and even having your export privileges cut off. Privileges, what did I say? That's right, exporting is a privilege. It's not a right. There's no constitutional right to export. So that's why it's so important to understand the rules and follow them correctly. The thing to keep in mind is that it's not just the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is the agency within the Department of Commerce that has jurisdiction over the export administration rights, but there are other regulations and other agencies that are involved in export compliance. And so the first one we have listed here is the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR is the acronym, and that covers exports of defense articles and technical data. And that is, the jurisdiction falls under the Department of Defense, and Department of State. The regulations of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC is the acronym, they have jurisdiction over U.S. embargoes and sanctions. The foreign trade regulations fall under the Bureau of Census, the Foreign Trade Division of the Bureau of Census, and covers the filing of export declarations in the automated export system. And then the last one that we mentioned that we're focused on today is the Export Administration Regulations, and essentially we talk about how these cover exports of commercial, dual use, and certain defense articles and technology. What we mean when we say dual use is are items that have both a commercial and military or proliferation application. But keep in mind that purely commercial items without an obvious military use are also subject to the Export Administration Regulations. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly here is some of you may be aware of the fact that there's been this initiative that began back in 2009 called Export Control Reform, or ECR, another acronym for your list. And essentially with Export Control Reform, what the President did is he directed a broad-based interagency review of the current export control system, and the hopes really were of putting higher walls around sensitive items while migrating those less sensitive items from the U.S. munitions list, which falls under the ITAR, over to the Commerce Control list under the Export Administration Regs, okay? So there's a lot more to ECR than just that, but That's kind of it in a nutshell. And so what we'll do today in reviewing the EAR is we'll talk about where do you find it, what are the general prohibitions, why do we have to be concerned with prohibitions, where can we find more information such as definitions and interpretations. What about country groups? Why are country groups important? How do we define those country groups? We'll get more into the Commerce Control List, or the acronym CCL, and that Commerce Control List covers regulated articles and technologies. We'll also talk about how to come up with a classification or an export commodity control number, or an ECCN. We'll talk about licenses and license exceptions, and then we'll wind down with the things to be concerned about, such as penalties and how to mitigate penalties by using a disclosure. And then lastly, where do you find updates? Okay, so where do you find the Export Administration Regulation? You can find it in Title 15 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's covered in parts 730 to 774. Now, certainly you can purchase a hard copy if you're one of those people that likes paper and likes to have a hard copy. And some people, that's just the way their brains work. They like to have everything, you know, in one set of regulations that they can earmark different and flag different things that are relevant to their business. But keep in mind, it is over 1,000 pages, and it is frequently revised, and those revisions are typically seen in the Federal Register. But you can also access this for free through the Bureau of Industry and Security, which again is the agency that has jurisdiction over the Export Administration Regs. And we have their URL right here for you. And when you go to the main page, you can certainly click on the Regulations tab and then access either the whole book or individual parts, and we'll see a little bit more of that here. Now, in terms of the Export Administration Regs, here is an example of the different parts of the Export Administration Regulations that you can download. So you can download the Table of Contents, the Commerce Control List. If you want to look at specific categories that would be covered for purposes of classifying your good, each of those categories is laid out here, so on and so forth. So this is just a snapshot, if you will, of what's covered in the Export Administration Regs downloads page. And there are a lot of things that you're not allowed to do that are referred to as the general prohibitions, and they're found in Part 736 of the Export Administration Regulations. And I guess the key thing here to keep in mind is that these prohibitions are not necessarily freestanding. They're actually cross-referenced in other parts of the Export Administration Regs. But I mean, this is the overall list, but you'll see throughout the EAR different prohibitions scattered throughout that further strengthen the understanding of the exporter about what they can and can't do. Bottom line is, if you violate any of these general prohibitions, or you engage in any other conduct that's contrary to the Export Administration Regs, or of any license authorization or license exception, then really bad things can happen. Really, you know, significant penalties can occur. You can end up losing your ability to participate in an export. In other words, being denied the opportunity to participate in an export. You yourself end up on a denial order. But essentially what these prohibitions do, and this is the overview, is you can't export or re-export to restricted countries. You can't re-export certain foreign-made articles that have more than a de minimis U.S. content without the proper authorization. You can't export to certain parties subject to a denial order. So I would go through all these, but bottom line is that the focus is on bad end users, bad end uses, bad destinations, support of bad activities. All of those different things are prohibited. And so we followed Jerry's slide with the key questions you have to ask in order to have a legal export, because there are several things that can go awry if you're not vigilant and you're not paying attention. And I think one thing I'd also like to mention on Jerry's pie chart when he was talking about licenses is that, you know, oftentimes people will say to me, well, it's only, you know, a small percentage of goods requires export licenses. Why do I care? Why don't I just simply say everything is does not require a license and falls into this basket category? Why can't I do that? And the problem is because obviously that's not compliant. There are instances where you will find that you actually may have a controlled item and you may actually need a license. And so that's really critical in terms of understanding the importance of navigating these regulations, that, you know, not everything will end up being subject to the ability to ship without a license or a license exception. It's important to know that there are updates to the Export Administration Regs. They happen routinely. They can happen due to legislation, but continued efforts with the Export Control Reform Initiative, and also changes to the international regimes that we mentioned earlier. And so really the best way to keep up with those changes is to check the postings at the BIS website. And when you click on that regulations tab, you can look under the Federal Register, and it can certainly help you see what changes have occurred most recently. Well, what if you need to access a specific definition or an interpretation? Where would you go for that? If you go to Part 772 of the Export Administration Regs, it has an extensive list of definitions that are used in the Export Administration Regs and the Commerce Control List. So, for example, if you're trying to understand what do people mean or what is meant by the terminology end user, the definition is laid out there that it's the person abroad that receives and ultimately uses the exported or re-exported items. And it goes on to say, hey, keep in mind the end user is not a forwarding agent or intermediary, but maybe a purchaser or ultimate consignee. So that's a really important definition, because a lot of times people they get confused about who the final end user is, and it's really important to know who that party is for purposes of ensuring compliance with the general prohibitions, meaning that you don't ship to a bad end user. Okay, and then Part 770 of the Export Administration Regs also has interpretations of terms and phrases that are used in the regulations. So the example we have here is, for example, what is the interpretation of classification of parts, okay? Classification of parts includes machinery, equipment, or other items, parts of machinery or other items. So you have different resources and definitions within both 772 and 770.